Karina baby. For the third, we have Runaway Beans. Let's take a look. Runaway beans, the beans that I'm sowing, keep growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. And if they don't stop, when they get to the top, I'll never know where they are going. Look at her beans. Just like you, Karina Bean. You are growing and growing and growing. Let's go to Paul's greatest flapjack, Griddle. One day late in October, Sam awoke to hear a slow, rhythmic humming type of sound coming from next door. He rose and got dressed and went outside to investigate. Next door, he found Sally helping her father, who was splitting wood with an axe. "I'm getting this wood ready for our new wood-burning stove," Sally's father told Sam. "You look like Paul Bunyan," Sally said. "I don't feel like him. Puff, puff," Sally's father replied. "What do you feel like?" "I feel like taking a break." Well, they rested and they drank some hot chocolate. Sam and Sally inspired her father by reading him the story about Paul Bunyan. There they are, having some good hot chocolate and reading about Paul Bunyan. Paul's Flapjack Griddle. From Paul Bunyan and his great big ox. When Paul Bunyan arrived in the Dakotas, he was very much pleased over the prospect there was of being set up in a new logging record. The timberlands of the states were ideal for his work, the easy conditions being quite different from the harsh ones he has known in Maine and other eastern states. In the first place, most of the land was level, that it was very easy to get the logs, and the streams and the trails were already so straight that there was but little work for Babe to do in straightening them. In fact, this new location was just about all that he could desire for logging on a tremendous scale. So Paul set to work with great enthusiasm. Paul had been accomplished westward by most of the men who had been with him in Maine. There were the 7 axemen, the little choir boy, and the faithful old of them in addition. There were so famous of loggers as Chris Crosshall, Hard Jaw Murphy, Windy Night, Rose Nose Jack and Blue Nose Mark, Shot Gunserson, Handy Hank, Bristol Bill, and a whole host of others, mighty workers, every one of them, and all as proud as porter's pigeons to be working for such a boss as Paul Bunyan. Both Babe and Willie and the big and little oxen came along. Following close to their master's heels, all the way and carrying their backs and their tools, supplies, to their property that was to be used to the new camp. Some historians think that Paul also moved all of his camp buildings to the Dakotas, but that was probably done on one of his later moves, as the biggest building from the main camp would hardly have been big enough even for the tools house in the Red River camp. After it got to going full blast, Paul left his old camp in Maine very early in the morning, and so anxious was he to get to location in his new camp that he hurried along at quite a fast pace. So called the Red River along about sunset of the afternoon. Most of his men kept up with him pretty well, but some of the strangers didn't arrive until along some time the next morning. Paul saw at once that he would be able to work very fast in clearing off the level land. These pines must be a new victory, he said to a big Swede. I have never seen any quite like them before. Do you notice how none of them stood up straight, but all leaned the same way? I think I'll give them the name Leaning Pines and notify the tree experts back east so that they can write about them in books. Indeed, there was something very peculiar about the big pines that covered the land so thickly, for they all leaned at just exactly the same angle towards the south. Ole, however, shook his head over what Paul had said. I think they being ordinary white pines, he disagreed. A tank hudgens make 'em lean that way. It so happened that this time Ollie was more right than Paul, for his leaning trees were now was not a new species at all. Their straight particulars had been caused by the big swade suspected by the Hudgens, and frightful looking, but entirely harmless animals, which was them to be found in great numbers in the Dakota woods. The hoogag was quite large, with a body like a buffalo, and often weighed as much as 2 tons. Its head and neck were absolutely hairless. Its wrinkled ears flapped downwards, its bushy tails wiggled constantly, and it had large, muscular lips, which prevented it from feeding on grass or other low-grown hedgings, but which were of the greatest use, like a trunk of an elephant. It stamping from tree bark to tree bark and twigs, which were its usual food. Its greatest oddity, though, was its legs. They were long and stiff, particularly straight, being entirely without joints in them, and since they therefore could not be bent, the hogging could never, there he is, lie down as other animals do. It lived its whole life walking and sleeping upon its feet. Occasionally, one day, it would be, by some chance, fall or be thrown to the ground, and as it could not bend its leg to get to its feet again, it would then peacefully, hopelessly, and soon die of fright or starvation. Its a strange manner of sleeping was the cause of this leaning pines. When it wanted to take a nap, it would face the west and lean its left side against the trunk of the pine tree, brace its hind legs firmly, but never ceasing to mark time with its sply-footed front ones, hung down its head and closed its eyes, and in its manner it would rest comfortably. Countless hoggins had followed this exact habit through many centuries, and the pressure of their weight against the trees of the Dakota wood had after many years caused all the pines to lean towards the south in the manner which had at first deceived Paul. The most successful hunter of the queer animal followed the custom of cutting partly through the base of the trees until they were almost ready to fall, so that when the hedgings leaned against one, both the tree and the animal would come down. As it could not then get up upon its feet, it was easily captured or killed. Since the hogging had almost entirely disappeared, this method of hunting has been abandoned and forgotten, as it had never proven successful with any other animal. The uniform slant of the trees was the great aid in cutting them, for they all fell in exactly the same direction without any guidance on the part of the cutters. Paul was therefore able to use his great 3 mil saw to the best advantage. When its blade passed through the furthest, it ate its way through the thousands of trunks in its path like a mowing machine in a hayfield, and the trees lying evenly side by side in windrows on the ground, ready to be cut into logs and snakes away. Paul was so strong that he did not have to have much help with the big saw, and he usually put the little... Look at that animal. Isn't it amazing how it leaned all the trees the same exact way? So they all slept the same exact way for centuries. It's something that's innate, and it's probably like just... It's amazing how they did that. Put the little choir boy to the order the end to balance it down. He didn't care whether the little choir boy did not to balance it down. He did not care whether the little choir boy did much saw work with the other end or not. And he never said anything when the youngster would hang onto the saw handle and ride back and forth on the blade and cut through the trees. He did not, but he did occasionally get the little angry when the lad thrustily allowed his feet to drag on the ground. After the full crew got to working in the Dakota woods, the trees were cut down as fast that it was not very long before the poor Hudgens could no longer find places to lean, and as a result they soon became perishing for lack of sleep. Nearly all of them died during the winter that Paul had his big camp in Red River, and it is only very rarely that a stray one has been seen since that time. It was on the banks of the Red River of the north that Paul had set up his camp, and there he assembled one of the greatest logging crews that he has ever existed. So many men did he have in camp that one of the bunkhouses had 137 tiers of bunks, and the men used to go to bed with balloons and came down in the morning with parachutes. It was a happy sight to see them early in the morning, pouring out of their bunks and floating down the great clouds just about the time that the roosters were getting breakfast well underway. No alarm clocks were needed in Paul's camp. He knew lumberjacks pretty well. Paul did, and so he just had a big pipe straight from the cook shanty to the bunkhouse, and the boiler fixed in it. In the morning, when the cooks had their first fires going, and vessels be grinding to cooks, and the coffee steaming, the boiler fan was turned on, and the smell of the breakfast blew right into the bunkhouses. Then the Jacks did grab his parachute and jump out of the bunk right away. The camp doctor was set to look him over, for everyone knew that he must be sick. Paul found that feeding his many men was a very good deal of a job, and essentially did he find it hard to give them all the flapjacks they wanted, for they all seemed to have developed an extraordinary craving for that favorite delicacy. Since all of his men were so fond of flapjacks, he had to figure out a way to give them all they wanted, for he liked to keep his helpers satisfied. Look at that. The special flapjack stove, which he had brought with him from Maine, has disappeared in a very strange manner. Shortly after he arrived in the Dakotas, the queer passion for hot cakes, which constantly strewed Willie. One morning, he had struck his head onto the kitchen and eaten the day's supply at one gulp. He tapped off his tidbit by swallowing the red-hot flapjack stove as a dessert. And as a result, he developed a very painful case of stomachache, from which he soon died. Just what Paul did with his body is not certain, though. The story goes that he sold the carcass that year. It was about 1857 when Willie died, it is said, to various packing companies in Chicago. These meat packers made a very good thing out of the remains of poor Willie, working him up and selling him for high prices. Not all of our stock has been disposed of yet, so much of him was there, and thousands of people in the day and age are familiar with canned Willie. It is rumored that most of him that was still on hand when the Great War broke out was sold to the government to feed the soldiers and sailors. And some day there may be an investigation to find out if this is true or not. Paul Bunyan puzzled over the problem of getting enough flapjacks for his men, and finally he ordered Big Ollie to make him a huge griddle. So big was the griddle that the cooks greased it with telephone poles, on the ends of which were tied great bunches of gunny sacks or swabs. As Paul kept on hiring more and more men all the time, however, it was not very long before he became far too small, and he had no problem to settle all over again. Someone at last told him where he could get a much bigger griddle to take the place of the one that was now outgrown. But it was so large that he couldn't at first figure out how to get it to camp. Luckily, it was perfectly round in shape, and thought it was so thick when it was stood on edge that it made a track as wide as a wagon. I just want to see where the level is. Alright, it looks okay. My battery's about to die. Road and wide as a wagon road, and was terribly hard to lift. Paul soon thought out a way to get it to a place where he wanted it. Being so hard pressed by the need for more flapjacks in camp, he had started working the investive side. He has side of his brain again, and it was at the last time that he invested the electromagnetic. He and Ollie made two enormous big ones, so strong that when they were tested out for the first time, they pulled all the axes and saws and other tools out of the hands of the men in the woods within 5 miles of the camp. Seeing the trouble that they had caused, Paul shot off the magnets at once. But it was worse than jigsaw puzzles sorting out all the things that had been pulled into camp. He was quite pleased, however, with a demonstration by the magnets, for he knew that they were just the things to keep him get the big griddle to where he wanted it. Shortly before this, he had brought a team of mules, Jerry and Ginny, intending to use them occasionally while he gave Babe a rest. This mule team could travel so fast after they had had their regular feed and 10 bushels of wheat apiece that no one else could hold them in, and so Paul always had to drive them himself. He used them hitched to the big flat bottom wagon without wheels. So now he harnessed up the mules, fixed the new magnets into the back of the wagon, and drove off on where the griddle was. He swung the magnets around until their strength drew the griddle right up to its edge, and then he drove off lickety-cut through the camp. The pull of the magnets got the griddle ground around so fast and following him at such a great rate of speed that he could hardly know how to stop it. For the faster the mules went, just that much faster did the griddle roll along behind trying to catch up. It was clearly impossible for him to run away from it. When he at last passed over the spot where he wanted it, he just dropped the magnets out of the wagon and pulled up to one side, in which what would happen, look at that magnet in his mouth. Rolled around and around like a big pig pen circling about the floor. At its loss, its speed after some time spins it, getting nearer and nearer to where the magnets lay. It kept rolling weaker and weaker until finally it twisted around a couple of times more just in place where he wanted it, and gouged out the big hole in the ground as it turned. Then it settled down. As nice as you please, right flat over the hole it had dug, and there it was at last, all ready for use, and with a place for the fire underneath. Paul then built a high furnace around the griddle, and right beside it he put a couple of big buildings to hold his pancake flour. So perfectly did he have these buildings arranged that the others just like them and used today as elevators for stewing grain. He also invented a machine for mixing up the hot cake batter, and had Ollie make 8 or 10 of them, which were placed in position by the griddle. These machines of Paul's are also copied today, and anyone may see many small models of them by using a paving contractions for making concrete. There is now, said Paul, the sourdough Sam, the head baker of the camp, who also had charge of all the flapjack making. There is the griddle to be proud of, a griddle which it should be a pleasure to work with. Everything is nice and handy. There is plenty of room to ensure the best of results, and from now on you should find the subject of flapjacks as interesting as that of your sourdough bread. Sam was doubtful at first, for he had several disastrous experiences with flapjacks in the past. Once having his mixed vat burst and found a landscape from miles around within thin and sticky flapjack batter, and he was not at all optimistic about making hot cakes on tremendous scales, which Paul had just made provisions for. However, after he began to get used to the new arrangement, he began also to get interested in the intricacies of flapjack making. It was not long, therefore, until he was turning his grain hot cakes with all the artistry which he had hitherto reserved exclusively for his first love, sourdough bread. From the time on his flapjacks were so wonderful that the man still talk about them, and no other griddle expert has ever been able to equal him in the preparation of the superior delicacy. Everything was worked out on the very definite schedule, and it was truly a wonderful sight to see the big griddle being put to its daily use. Although in the afternoon every day a gang of 300 flapjack cooks would start getting down the flour and fixins from the elevators, sort the mixers, going and stirring up the batter until the careful supervision of the boss baker. Meanwhile, as the batter was being mixed, the cook boys would have to grease the griddle. This they did by strapping the whole hams or sides of bacon on their feet and skating around over the hot surface. When the batter was all ready and greased down, someone on the edge would blow a whistle, and so big was the griddle that it cooked 4 minutes for the sound to get across. At this signal, all the cook boys would skate to the edge and climb high to the fence that it had been fixed for the purpose. A cook was then trip the chute from the mixers, and out would roll a wave of flapjacks, batter 10 feet high. Any poor cook boy who hadn't climbed out of the way and was overtaken the spreading batter was the worst kind of luck, for he would be found later in the flapjack just like a resin in the cake. Paul had a hard time at first figuring out how to flip the flapjacks over onto the other side so that both sides of it would be cooked the same. Everyone had, of course, seen flapjacks flipped up in the air on a skillet, so that when they came down again, they had turned completely over, and the undone side had a chance to get browned in its turn. Of course, the big griddle and the flapjacks on it were far too heavy for any wrist to flip in an ordinary manner. So, for a while, everybody had to eat flapjacks that was done only on one side. Oh, let's take a look at these boys. And they're skating across the entire frying pan on bacon to grease it. Oh, look at that. Kaboom. Tried rigging a black and trickle arrangement for turning the big hot cakes over, but that did not work very well, and the plan was abandoned. At last he hit a scheme of flipping it over with dynamite, when all worked out so well that it was used from that time on. However, one side of the flapjack became done. He would explode a ton or so of dynamite under it, and away up in the air the big cake would sail until it was almost out of sight. But putting a few more sticks under the one side and then under the other had made sure that it would turn over well in the air. And so nicely did the calculation and the exact amount of explosive to use each time that when the flapjack came down again, it landed exactly on the griddle with the brown side uppermost. After this, Paul's men never had any cause for kicking about the flapjacks in the Red River camp, except occasionally when a cook boy was caught by a batter and served up in the hot cakes, which usually didn't happen more than 2 or 3 times a month. Oh my god. Oh, that's the end of it. There's this flapjack. Hopefully they don't find a cook boy in it. Karina, baby, I love you so incredibly much, and I miss you. You know, I just love you, and I just miss you, and I just hope that you're having a good day today, honey, and hope that you're content no matter what. Always stay content in your situation. Things don't always go the way that you want them to, and that's okay. Like, every day is going to be a little bit different. Every day is going to be a little hard, a little good, a little of everything, you know, and you just have to sit inside yourself and be like, how am I doing today? And it's okay if you're not having a good day. There's always tomorrow. There's always another day. I hope that you're having a good day, though, and I hope that you're content, and I hope that you're happy, and I hope that you're enjoying the stuff that you're doing. Just want you to know that I love you and that I miss you. Let's do we sit and watch the rain as it falls from the sky. And we are glad to be inside where it is warm and dry. Oh yes, I do love the rain. It keeps the earth so clean and helps the pretty flowers grow from the mountains to the streams. I'm grateful that my battery kept up with the video today. I was afraid it was going to shut off. It's almost dead. I love you so much, though, and I miss you so much. And I can't wait to see you. I just hope that you're doing well. I love you. I do love Papa, too. I just hope you guys are doing well. I miss you. I miss you so much, honey.